Hello, and welcome to the Working with Variables module of the Research Data Training series. I am Paul Byrne, Research Data Services Librarian at Syracuse University Libraries. What we will cover today is defining your variables, naming and labeling your variables, putting labels to your values, working with identification variables, using continuous versus categorical variables, recoding variables, and working with missing values. First, you need to define your variables. Define all the variables you will need before you start collecting any data. Start with the variables you will need to test your hypotheses. Be sure to include variables that will be created after the data has been collected. Include demographic information if appropriate. And be sure to include identification variables. ID variables are variables to use in matching data records to paper or other instruments, as well as matching data records across multiple files. If you're not sure at this point if you'll need a particular variable or not, include it. It will be much easier to drop it or just ignore it later on than it will be to have to go back and add it in. Let's talk about variable names and labels. You should use descriptive variable names, something that indicates what the variable is measuring. Using a question number from a survey or other form is acceptable, and this makes it easy to go back and forth between the data and the form. If your field has specific naming conventions, be sure to use them. If you're using secondary data, do not change the variable names, as this will make it easier for other people to understand what you have done. If you'll need to use sample code that comes with secondary data, or data collection forms, typically those used in psychology and education, then be sure to name your variables as they do in the code. That way, you'll simply have to copy and paste the code into your own program and just run it. Be sure to label all of your variables. Try to keep the labels to 80 characters or less for compatibility across different software. As much as possible, use the question text without changing the meaning of the question. This may seem obvious, but even a change in one word can have a profound effect on the meaning. If you're using secondary data, then use the labels that came with the data. Now let's talk about labeling the variable values. First, be sure to label all values as appropriate. Be consistent with your labels. For example, all yes/no questions where yes is always coded as 1 and no is always coded as zeros. Since some software restricts how you can use string variables, you should enter numbers for categorical and nominal variables, and then use value labels to describe those values. For example, enter a 1 in your data instead of the word male. Using numeric values will give you more options later on. Remember that check all that apply questions on surveys can be treated, at least for data entry purposes, like a series of yes/no questions. If they checked it, then it's like they answered yes. If they do not check it, then it's as though they answered no. Do not enter blanks though. Let's move on to identification variables. If you have a paper instrument or data collection forms, then you want to write or preprint an ID number on the paper and enter it in the data as a variable. This is so you can match a line of data to a specific paper instrument. It will be very important to be able to do this during the data cleaning phase of your project. If you're doing longitudinal research, then make sure your ID variables are consistent across implementations, as this is how you'll match records from time 1 to time 2 to time 3, and so on. If you'll be using secondary data along with your own, be sure you have an ID variable or variables in each file that you can use to match records. You should determine before you collect your own data what the secondary data is using, and do the same. Remember that some analyses in some software requires a single unique identification variable. Some secondary data comes with more than one variable that need to be combined to identify a single record. A unique identifier can be created by concatenating these variables, not adding or multiplying them. Regardless of what identification variables you might have, you may find it useful to create a variable that simply numbers the records from 1 to however many you have. This is especially important if your data need to be in a specific order for a particular analysis or other reason. Having this variable will allow you to get the data back into the original order after sorting. Let's talk about using continuous versus categorical variables. As much as possible, you should try to collect the continuous form of a variable rather than the categorical. This will give you more options in terms of data analysis later on. Specifically, ask the respondent to write in their income rather than giving them categories to select. Ask for the number of times they do something per day, week, or month, etc., instead of how often. Terms such as rarely and very often can mean different things to different people. Remember, you can always collapse or categorize the continuous data later on, but categorical data cannot be expanded into a continuous form. You should collect the components of variables. For example, ask for the day, month, and year they were born instead of the respondent's age. Ask for height and weight instead of BMI. You can write code to calculate age and BMI later on. Of course, you must balance asking for all this specific information against the likelihood of the question being answered and being answered honestly. Some people do not want to give their specific birth date, weight, or income. Also, very importantly, be sure to anonymize the data before sharing it. Variables such as birth date and income are personally identifiable information and will need to be removed from the data before it can be published. Let's move on to recoding variables. First, don't edit the original variable. Always create a new variable to hold the recoded values. That way, if you make a mistake, you will still have the original variable and can simply delete and recreate the recoded one. Also, do not delete the original variable once you have recoded it, as you might want to try a different categorization or formula. The exception to this, of course, is if it's necessary to protect confidentiality when creating a version to share. Always, always, always check your work. Use crosstabs or check the mean, minimum, and maximum for each category to make sure that your recoding has given you the results you expect and need. Now let's talk about missing values. Remember, missing and zero are not the same thing. Zero is a legitimate number and will be used in any calculations. Most software will drop any record that has a missing value for a variable in analyses. How a particular software package treats missing data in formulas depends on the formula and the software. Be sure you know what it will do before you start. Therefore, you need to develop codes and value labels for missing data. The code should describe the reason why the data is missing, such as when a person doesn't know or refuses to answer the question, or where the question was inappropriate, such as asking a man how many months pregnant he might be. When you do develop the codes, don't use values that could be legitimate values for that variable. A common practice is to use one more digit than a legitimate value for that variable. For example, if the values for the variable can range from 1 to 7, then use 8899. Or if it can range from 1 to 50, then use 888999, etc. Another method is to use negative values. Assuming there are no legitimate negative values in your data, you can always use the same code for the same thing. For example, always using -2 to mean refused. Using codes like these makes it easier to spot the missing values when cleaning and analyzing your data. Most statistical software will allow you to designate these as special missing codes and will be treated as missing and dropped from any analyses. So, in conclusion, careful planning and attention to what variables you will need and how you will collect and manipulate them is critical to the success of your project. Know how your software works so you can properly manipulate and analyze your data. Thank you. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know. Our contact information can be found on the web page. Now, on to the next module, documenting your data.